Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Combat Zone. I'm Nick. He's Joseph. And this is the place where the enemy only has four things to say. Abandon ship, bail out, take cover, and I surrender.
We surrender.
They surrender.
They
never surrender.
What is the replacement pronoun for they?
Them.
Them. No, like the new fad, like the 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 Z's, there's surrender.
Z surrender or make one up. I don't know.
Well, that's just about it too. Make one up, right?
Yeah, because who's ever heard of something?
We should get Jordan Peterson on the show one week.
Oh, that'd be a blast.
Just call him up, see what he has to say.
If we can get him, we should see if we can work that out with his
I think
people.
all I have to do is call.
Well, let's tell you what. Let's make it our mission in life.
Well, I've got more things in life to be, paying attention to than whether or not I get Jordan Peterson on the show.
Oh, are you kidding me?
Well, yeah, no, I'm not kidding you.
Well, let's put it this way. In the short term, it would be huge.
Okay. Okay, so a couple of things quickly. First of all, if you're hearing a buzz in the background, just ignore it.
Yeah, that's
because we were struggling. We were struggling for about a half an hour here tonight, trying to find the source of this buzz, little hum buzz or whatever. And if you're not hearing it, it's because you're listening to the show. Well, if you're not hearing it right now and you're listening to the show live, then that means we found the problem and fixed it without even realizing it. But otherwise, you might not be hearing it if you're listening to the show as a podcast later on, because it will have been filtered out because we have the technology to do that. Number to call, toll free, anywhere in North America, 844-415-2115 if you want to join the conversation live, or you can join us in our chat room. Click on the chat bubble in the live player. Register if it asks you to prove you are a genuine warm-blooded human being. And
we don't want none of the cold-blooded ones.
We will even take you and your input if you are a cold-blooded human being.
Well, the cold-blooded human beings would take a while, considering how cold it is outside, to say anything. They'd be like Ents from Lord of the Rings. Ents take a long time to say anything, because to say anything in Old Entish takes a long time to say.
Nick, you're being very quiet. You should make sure you speak louder, because otherwise they won't hear you.
Okay, well, I'm going back to being hot-blooded.
Oh, that was a cold-blooded imitation.
That was, you know what an Ent is, right?
A what?
An Ent. E-N-T. Ent.
I'm afraid I missed that one in grade school.
No, it's in Lord of the Rings. You never watched Lord of the Rings?
Well, okay, you know what? I did see. How many episodes were there?
Well, three movies.
3 movies. Okay, that's what I meant. How many movies? That was in
Twin Towers, I believe.
I saw the first one. I saw the first one with my son, and I don't want to say his girlfriend because that's really not what she. It was very strange. It was very strange. One day I'll tell you about it, Nick.
Okay.
Off the air.
I'll take your word for it that it was strange.
It was. It reminds me that it was a long movie, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
But Twin Towers wasn't all that long, and that's when Merry and Pippin escaped the Uruk-hai.
Okay.
Into the Fangorn
Okay,
forest.
We're into the weeds here.
Yeah, I know, but
totally.
How many people? Tell me something. For those of you listening, join the chat room and tell Joseph he's got a massive hole in his cultural upbringing. He's got to watch Lord of the Rings, the extended edition. It's just one of the greatest movies ever made. Series of movies.
Okay.
Anyway, I thought you would see the reference. If you don't get the reference, then what I was trying to do didn't work. I thought you'd have seen it. That's all.
Well, I understand the cold-blooded thing, Nick. I just don't understand the connection between cold-blooded and, your fantasy, movie world.
Well, Ents speak
I'm sorry. You are on a much higher plane than I am when it comes to entertainment. I'm still stuck on Get Smart and Hogan's Heroes.
Both of which I enjoy, by the way.
Yes, I know, but still.
But Lord of the Rings is
older
older
than those two. You're much more
sophisticated
than I am.
But Lord of the Rings is older than those two.
Not the movies.
No. Well, there was a cartoon movie that ended They did it back in the 70s and ran out of money, so they just showed them walking into Mordor, and that was the end of the movie.
Okay, well, if it was in the 70s, then it's still Get Smart and Hogan's Heroes was the 60s.
But okay, I'm going to obviously have to fill in that gap in your education, because that's huge. My kids are such Lord of the Rings nerds. They've read the Silmarillion. They've read The Hobbit. You should see my oldest daughter go nuts when she talks about the problems with the Hobbit movie, the Battle of the Five Armies and all that stuff. She just loses her mind.
I missed that.
Well, I thought it was a very entertaining movie, even if it wasn't all that accurate to the book. How we got on that, I have no idea.
Well, and now, while we're on the subject of total fantasy land make-believe, okay, I think we should spend some time talking about the make-believe Prime Minister's office here in Canada. And of course, it's not really make-believe, which is the tragedy. It is kind of like a fantasy land there, but they do wield real power. So,
it's like a real nightmare you can't wake up from.
It's a nightmare for them the last couple of weeks,
which is a pleasant change.
So Gerald Butts
resigned.
Now Gerald Butts is the Prime Minister's best bud,
right?
And,
each other
I should know this stuff. You were supposed to be prepared before we go on air, but he's
they've
the
known
Prime
each
Minister's
other since your days at McGill.
Yeah, they've known each other for a long time, but I'm just trying to think of whether or not he was principal secretary or cabinet secretary or whatever.
Whatever his official
principal advisor anyway.
He ran the PMO. He was second. He was unofficially second in command because
there's a chief of staff. There's a chief of staff.
Yeah, I know that, but that's the official title. And if he held that, okay, because I can't remember exactly what his official title was either. But the truth is that he was the guy that ran the PMO. It had to go through Justin Trudeau. It had to go through Butts before it got to Trudeau, and it always went. Butts filtered it and told Trudeau how to react to things. And now, the nice thing about
it's kind of like Trudeau was a robot.
Well,
I am Justin Trudeau. Tell me what to say.
iRobot, yes.
iRobot. There's another movie. Have you seen that one?
Yes. God,
when do you get to work, Dick? I don't see any of these movies.
I've got kids who watch this stuff.
Oh, that must be the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have a lot of kids.
I get it by osmosis.
How many kids do you have now?
What's that?
How many kids do you have now?
The same as I had yesterday.
I know.
8 of them.
Tell people how many kids you have.
8 children.
8 children. How many grandchildren?
3. 2 are born. One's on the way in May. April, May. I don't know.
God willing.
It'll show what the youngster will show up when they are good and ready.
Okay, back to the Prime Minister's office.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. First of all, whatever official title Mr. Butts held, he was obviously a very influential member of the inside circle inside the PMO. And I do not, first of all, he went through the motions of resigning. I have no doubt he wrote out his resignation. I have no doubt he handed it to the Prime Minister, and I have no doubt that in a formal sense the Prime Minister received it. I also have no doubt that Gerald Butts is now working from home.
Yes, but is he being paid by taxpayers?
Well, you don't think Trudeau's going to spend his own money, do you?
Oh, gee, Nick.
Of course he's going to be paid. They'll find a way. Look,
they'll find a way to pay him.
Yeah, of course.
He'll become a special advisor.
Gerald Butts is a very clever man, and they will find a way to compensate him. That's just, they live and breathe this stuff. This is what they do all the time. So, setting how he gets compensated aside, he'll be at home in his PJs with a cup of coffee at 10 o'clock in the morning, texting the Prime Minister what to say about this or that. He resigned in name, yes, but he didn't resign as a special, friend on the phone, giving advice, unsolicited advice. Okay. And it's up to Trudeau to take it or not. Well, Trudeau, as there's a lot of people say he's as dumb as a bag full of hammers, he's not that dumb. He would take that advice because it's worked for him up until now. So I don't believe this resignation has any teeth to it. I think that all they did was said, look, go back to South Ottawa, wherever you live, and just call in or just text me, and we'll make it look like, we'll feed the lions, but it'll be a straw man that we feed them, because you're not going anywhere. And I don't believe for a second that he's not going to have any influence in the PMO now that he's resigned. I don't believe that for a second.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what has brought this to fruition. What exactly? Let's talk a little bit about the background to this, because people are listening and they go, okay, well, who is this guy? Butts. That really is his name, by the way. Butts. Yes. Gerald Butts. So we're not making fun of anybody. Just okay. We are treating liberals with absolute respect and dignity. Okay. At least the respect and dignity that they deserve.
We won't talk about what you might call. Never mind.
Okay, we're not going there, Nick. We're not going there. Okay. We made a pledge that this was going to be a family-friendly show right from the word go, and we have honored that.
I didn't want to talk about holes.
Okay, no, we're not. Do not talk that way, Nick. Okay. Don't even. Nick, stop thinking about it.
I said I wouldn't.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
I'm not talking about holes.
So, where are we here? Yeah. Okay. So why does he resign? This is the thing. This is what's very puzzling for everybody. Everybody is very puzzled by the fact that Gerald Butts has resigned, because everybody in the Prime Minister's office has sworn that nothing untoward occurred with respect to SNC-Lavalin,
yep.
Or the preferred or deferred prosecution track, or the Attorney General, or the former Attorney General, I should say, or the current Attorney General, or any kind of cabinet or ministerial interference in the judicial process. So all of this stuff has been floating around for a few weeks now, and everybody's going, oh no, we have nothing was done wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Then all of a sudden we wake up in the morning and Gerald Butts has resigned.
I know, on a Monday, on a holiday.
Very odd.
Look, in essence, what happened was he said, I did nothing wrong, therefore I'm resigning.
You know, you're saying that tongue-in-cheek, but essentially that's exactly what happened. It's very bizarre.
I'm not being tongue-in-cheek at all. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, because I still, as you know, Nick, I'm not a liberal. I'm not a philosophical liberal, ideological liberal member or anything like that. I'm okay. But I have defended the process in the past, and whenever I think that Justin Trudeau, liberal or not, is getting a bum deal, I'm not afraid to say so. I absolutely. So with this, I'm going.
Did he just get kicked in the butts?
I don't know. This is, I knew you couldn't resist it, man.
Just asking.
My gosh. Nick, come on, man. He was
his Gerald Butts was Justin Trudeau's principal secretary.
Okay, the principal secretary. That's fine. Yes. Whatever the title was. Look, I don't get it. That's the bottom line. I don't get it. They're saying there's no fire, there's no smoke, nothing here to look at, folks. Move on. And by the way, I'm resigning.
Yeah.
Very bizarre. So, clearly there's something going on. And the way that all of this has transpired has done nothing but reinforce the desire for people to know what's going on, because it's so odd.
That is, the whole thing was just bizarre. And that's the part that I just don't understand. If there's nothing wrong, people don't resign because there's nothing wrong. They resign when there's wrongdoing. Well,
or no. People will resign if there's nothing wrong per se, but they become politics. They become a distraction to the messaging of the political party or the prime minister or the politician or whatever. So this is not unheard of in that respect. The problem here is that I don't think I've heard anyone talk about Gerald Butts as being a distraction. In other words, I haven't heard, there's been a lot of talk about, did the Prime Minister say something? Did the Prime Minister interfere with the Attorney General? Did the Attorney General interfere with this, the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin, or the potential prosecution? There's been a lot of, but Gerald Butts, his name didn't really come into the discussion, until very recently. And then all of a sudden, maybe it's a distraction. So sometimes people resign if for no other reason than to sort of make the issue go away. Look, I've gone, finished, all done. That's it. Okay?
But that's not the only person who ever mentioned being a distraction was Butts himself. there was a commentator
after the fact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There was on the radio today, as frustrating as it was trying to find some common sense and logic and reason on the radio today. One of the commentators said it seems like they have a 3-point plan. Throw somebody onto the grenade, take one for the team. That's Gerald Butts. They had to have a script. They had to kiss and make up with Jody Wilson-Raybould to bring her back.
Former Attorney General.
Yes. And they wanted to make sure that in order to appease the calls for let her speak by the opposition and by a growing number of Canadians, they decided to bring her back into the fold, kissy, make up, and let her stay within the party so that they could control what she says. You don't have to worry about what she says if you know what's going to be before she goes before the Justice Committee.
Yeah, but the reason she's not talking is not because she's a member of the party or she's under some sort of a gag order like that. I mean, she's the former Attorney General. She is bound by cabinet secrecy. She's bound by attorney-client privilege. She's bound by there's a number of
to her lawyer.
Eh?
The latest I read today is that she is not bound by there is nothing to waive. She is not bound by attorney-client privilege because it's the government that's the client, not the Prime Minister.
Okay, but if she's but the attorney-client privilege, I mean that's an opinion. Okay, I didn't read it or hear it, but it's fair enough. It's an opinion, but I wouldn't take that to the bank. Whether the government or the Prime Minister is the client, that there are still issues that she has to be cognizant of. Plus, again, there's cabinet secrecy. Plus, there's other issues around thinking attorney-client privilege and anyway, I can't remember the other one. There was one more that has to be taken into account. Look, it's not that simple. Okay, when the Attorney General takes on these cases and that and fulfills his or her role, they can't just go out and speak publicly, and it's not that they're in the party still, therefore they're bound by, the party's particular caucus confidentiality or whatever. That might be a case, but it's not a case in point here. That's not what she's caught up in.
Okay, well, either way, it doesn't really matter because everybody on these committees that she's going before, the Justice Committee, the Ethics Committee, and all that, they're all handpicked by the Liberals anyway. The chair of these organizations are all handpicked by the Prime Minister, report to the Prime Minister, and pass through his office before they're released. So this is a non sequitur. It's a foregone conclusion that what they're going to say, they already know what these reports are going to say. And they'll drag them out they're going to try and drag them out to the far side of the election so people will forget about them. They tried the same thing with Kathleen Wynne, remember? I can't speak about that. It's under investigation. And how long did those investigations take to conclude? Some of them, I would bet, are still ongoing. They just buried them in these investigations and said, "Oh, sorry, can't talk about that. Under investigation." And knowing that eventually people would forget about it and they would want to move on to something else. And I see this as one of the tactics that this particular government's doing. Now, I have some interesting polling numbers here, because this is having an impact. At least I think it is. According to the latest polls, the Nanos poll says the Liberals are now trailing the Tories 34 to 36%, and the NDP have 17% support. Leger poll surrounding that concentrates on who would be the best prime minister. Trudeau has taken a 7-point hit since last November when he was at 33%. Of the population thought he was the best person for the prime minister's job of all the available leaders. He's now down to 26%. When it comes to people who think that the prime minister did something wrong, the national average is 41% of people in this country think the prime minister is hiding something, think he's done something wrong. 27% of liberals think that. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a huge number from liberal ranks. The other one is 66% of Tories. Well, that's not surprising. The NDP say 12% think he did something wrong. Well, that's the NDP. Anyway, these numbers are going to have a cumulative effect. And I think there's, in one way, this certainly helps the conservative cause, although when people start to look at conservative options, there's a third party involved here, and that's the Maxime Bernier party, who now sit nationally at about 11% support.
11% support?
Yeah, 11% people, the poll I just read a few moments ago, said they would consider voting for a party led by Maxime Bernier.
Okay,
that's not exactly...
That's not actually support. I might consider supporting them.
Yeah, well, okay, but fair enough. But considering they were...
That's an older poll, though, right, if I'm not mistaken?
That was the most recent one I could find.
Okay, that's fine.
I forget the date on it, but...
I think that's a little high, but they're going to have an impact for sure.
Absolutely.
And, you're saying the issue you're raising, you say this is good for the conservatives. Well, or it may be good for the Conservative Party, but the question is the Conservative Party good for conservatives? That's always an open question in Canada.
Yes, it is.
That's actually an open question in most democracies around the world. So I guess I don't know.
One of the things I wanted. Okay, I've got some topics I want to put off until the second hour, but one of the things I do want to talk about is how frustrating it is, and we can delve into this a little bit. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but today I was driving around downtown, and there's 2 talk stations in this state, in our nation's capital. For those not listening in the Greater Ottawa area online, if you're from, let's say, Red Deer, Alberta, okay, I wonder why that name came to mind, or you're from Mushgush, Nova Scotia,
or you're from Tuktoyaktuk.
Or if you're listening up in did you know that
Tuktoyaktuk?
I've been that
you got to get the accent right.
Tuktoyaktuk. Right. Tuktoyaktuk.
Okay.
And
we're going to be in trouble now.
Has invited,
that's a human rights complaint right there.
Probably. The mayor of Tuktoyaktuk has invited my wife and I up to come and visit. Did you know that?
No. When did that happen?
When he extended the invitation to every Canadian. But they wanted you to see the new gravel road they put in.
Cool.
A land link. So you don't have to fly into Tuktoyaktuk. You can take your pickup truck and beat the hell out of it for the next 36 hours while you drive there.
So there's a road link to Tuktoyaktuk now?
Yep.
Cool.
Yep. So you don't have to depend. In the wintertime, I guess they have an ice road. In the summertime, they have a gravel road.
Ice road truckers.
There you go.
Did you ever do any ice road trucking?
No. And I had no interest in it.
No.
Because when the ice starts to ripple in front of you, as you're driving down there with your 120,000-pound load on, you best get off because it's about to give way. And some of those guys, they run right to the edge because it's the only way to get things in there. Anyway, that aside, I brought that up for a reason. What was I talking about?
We're just almost free associating here. It's like
know.
The old days when we first started the show, Nick. Remember, we'd sit around and go, what are we going to talk about today? But we do that actually while we were talking. And the funny thing was that it wasn't even live. Okay, so the first
I know what it was.
6 or 7 or dozen of the shows of the combat were actually recorded, and then we'd post them as podcasts. But we didn't have any chat room or anything like that. So we'd be free associating, and then we'd think, okay, why didn't we edit this part out when we were editing?
Those early shows were a little rough, I will admit.
Yeah.
However, the reason I brought all that up was because here in Ottawa we have the 2 talk stations. And I don't mean to give them a plug, but there's AM 1310 and you have 580. One of them I'm far more familiar with than the other. So I'm driving around downtown and I'm trying to find just one voice out there that comes from a little bit of common sense rather than the mainstream gobbledygook we normally get. And it drove me crazy. It drove me nuts because I'm listening to, on one station, I had this liberal who was excusing everything. And on the other station, I had a guy who didn't know whether he was liberal or conservative, couldn't put it into common layman's terms. And CBC's a basket case because it takes them forever to report on any of this stuff, and they always find a way to excuse it because they know where their bread is buttered. They're not going to go after the liberals the way that a well-run media should over something like this. They should be hounding these guys like they did Rob Ford. I mean, never give them a break. after him all the time. Now, I don't know about standing on a cinder block looking over the back fence, but they should, the moment he walks into or out of Parliament, when he gets out of his limo, wherever he is, at the airport, they should be hounding him, demanding answers. Because that's what our media is supposed to do when we have things like this. And the only thing they should care about is the truth, to get to the bottom of it and tell Canadians without filtering it through editorializing in their reporting, which CBC and other outlets are famous for. I even heard it on one of the AM stations, and I won't name it, but they were talking about a protest, which we'll talk about later, how they were against, some of the protesters were against this global immigration pact because they falsely believed that it cost Canada some of its sovereignty to agree to that. Well, who is the anchor to decide what's false or what's real? All they're supposed to do is read the news, not add in their own personal interpretation. When I was in terrestrial radio, and if I'd have tried that as a news anchor, not that I ever was one, but I know news anchors who got their butt handed to them by the program director and corrected it for the next broadcast. That would never have been allowed. And yet here it is. And it's hard. It's really frustrating when you're out there. So I guess the question, all of this to say, you and I, we do our best to provide a voice for people who think from the conservative point of view. Okay? Is there not enough of an appetite out there to run a proper, and when I say proper, I mean a full-blown radio station, TV station that's dedicated to doing this? I mean, what Ezra Levant is doing out west is great, but there's a lot of people who don't like Ezra Levant, who don't like his approach, even if they're conservative. They just find something irritating, and that's true of every personality I've ever run into. You're going to find people who don't like you just for who you are. It has nothing to do with the message you're trying to convey. Maybe your voice irritates them. Maybe there's something in the way that you present yourself they don't like. You're never going to get 100% people behind you. So there's room in this market, in my opinion, for something along, let's call, for another Rebel Radio, but that doesn't have to look the same thing, but presents news from a conservative point of view with a very high journalistic standard. And I think there's an appetite for that out there.
And I agree.
I was hoping you would.
And I think that we have to work hard to fill that. But before we do that, I think we have to go for a break. So we will be back in a couple of minutes.
All right, you guys stay there. We'll be back with more right after this on the Combat Zone.
So now we're back. Everybody missed our comedy routine, Nick.
So you mean to tell?
I'm Joe. Welcome back,
guys.
Break? Just since the break.
Oh, good.
Okay, cut now.
We had too much good stuff in the first half hour to go back and do that again.
No, man, I'm telling you, it's just you guys missed the whole comedy routine there. It's and we can't. And it was ad lib. It was like open mic here in the Combat Zone. And when I say, well, it's always open mic, but it was open mic
exactly
and yuck yucks. Okay. Except we kept it clean because this is a family-friendly show. So anyway, as I said, I'm Joe, he's Nick, and you are back in the Combat Zone. We had about a 30-second dead spot there, well,
we'll cram a minute into the next 30 seconds. That'll make up for it.
Okay.
All right.
Where are we now, Nick?
Okay.
On the list of things to talk about.
On the list of things to talk about, before we leave the federal stage, which is where I was going next, one of the tragedies about this whole sordid SNC-Lavalin affair isn't so much about them. It's because everything is about them. And by them, I'm talking about the Liberals and the Prime Minister. There are people around the planet who are Canadian, specifically in China, whose life is hanging by a thread because of our situation caught between the Americans and the Chinese. There are people, one guy, and maybe we've been over this before. He was convicted of trying to smuggle drugs into China, got caught and was given a 10-year sentence. Then after the Huawei executive was arrested in Vancouver, they upped his sentence to execution. Now, I do not know whether that gentleman is still alive or not. The reason I don't know is because you know something, as much as I just said they should have been after Prime Minister for this whole SNC thing, there's another reason for it, and that is to bring it to a head so we can get to the bottom of it and move on to other important issues like our relationship with China and the lives that hang in the balance. That's the tragedy, is that there's a guy. Can you imagine being this guy in China, innocent or guilty? Okay, he was given a 10-year sentence, and a 10-year sentence in Chinese jail is not the same thing as club fed here in Canada. Even if it's a max prison, like a maximum security prison, it's not a Chinese prison. So this guy's doing real time in a real jail. Then he finds out he's on death row. Can you imagine him finding out however he gets his information, and maybe he doesn't even know. Who knows what the Chinese government allows him to learn, while he's on death row. He may not have access to the internet. He may not have access to newspapers. Who knows? But if, that isn't that all the more the tragedy is we should be dealing with issues like this, not whether or not our prime minister broke the law in dealing with the attorney general and a criminal investigation, which is what all this is about in the first place. So I'm sitting here thinking, okay, how, that's not the only foreign affair issue or world stage issue. We have our ongoing relationship with India that's like, the Titanic and the iceberg. Okay, this country is not on friendly terms with India right now, thanks to our prime minister. There's issues in defense. You've got the Norman case, and there's allegations of that one being meddled in from the highest office in the land as well, although it's not getting the same kind of coverage as the Jody Wilson-Raybould story is. We just bought 18 worn-out Australian F-18s of exactly the same vintage as the ones that we are flying now. So the liberal answer to our defense needs when it comes to the Air Force is to say, look, we wore out our airplanes, so let's go buy exactly the same make and model of worn-out airplanes we have now, and that'll make everything better. And we'll fly them till 2030. Where they'll be over 55 years old, 50 or 55 years old. There's these kinds of issues that are out there that are not getting addressed. The media, you see them on websites like if you go to Bork or if you go to other Canadian news outlets. You see the headlines, but everybody's so wrapped up in what's going on. Everything from the protest from out west to the SNC Lavalin case to, the whole problem with what's going on internally in Canada is drawing people's attention away from other very serious world affairs that we should be dealing with. What's going on with our NATO missions? Do we have a NATO mission? Last I heard, it was Latvia and Mali. They were talking about Mali. What's going on there? If we're going to send troops into harm's way, the Canadian population has a right to know about it.
Well, I think you're touching on an important issue, but I don't think that there's anything nefarious around what's being reported and what's not being reported. I think that this is just a reflection of the people, the media, and the population, largely led by the media, focusing on just a handful of issues because, as you know, having been in the radio business and not so much in the news business, but in talk radio. But you know enough about the news business, Nick, to know that there's only a certain amount of time. A news broadcast might be 3 minutes, or it might be 4 minutes, or in a long broadcast might be 5 minutes. But whatever there's a limited amount of time, and so editorial decisions have to be made with respect to what we're going to pay attention to. What are we going to report today? And so it's kind of a flavor of the month kind of thing. And this SNC Lavalin thing has dominated the news cycle. And you're quite right. It's bumped off of the front pages, if you will, or off of the top of the reporting, some very serious issues. And I think you're quite right to bring us back into focus on some of the things that we've talked about already that have not been resolved. One of them being, Canadian citizens in China being arrested, being under threat of death, apparently in retaliation for the fact that we arrested and were holding pending extradition proceedings the vice president of Huawei. Huawei. I still, when I
Huawei.
say that, I went, Huawei.
Don't think it. Say it. Huawei.
Huawei.
Yeah.
Huawei.
Like WAWHY. Huawei.
Okay.
Don't try to say it like it's spelled. It's like trying to say my name the way it's spelled. You'll hurt yourself.
Okay. Whatever. But let's not make fun of a very serious issue here. What is happening with these guys in China? What's happening with that whole controversy? I heard recently that, or I read that Senator Lindsey Graham in the United States was taking a bit of a hard line and speaking out on behalf of Canadian citizens being mistreated in China. That was recently. That was within the last week. And I think, I can speak for all Canadians when I say, thank you to Senator Graham down in the United States for
couldn't agree more
for doing that. The question is again, what is our government doing or not doing, and what is the status of the whole situation? I don't know, and I wish I did, and I wish that we were reporting this because, again, we in the first half hour we talked about whether or not something actually happened that caused Gerald Butts to resign from the Prime Minister's office. Whatever he did, at least in the first instance, in my judgment, couldn't have been that bad for a lot of reasons. I'm not one of those people that thinks that there must be absolutely an inviolable, insurmountable, impenetrable wall between the elected representatives and the executive of government, the execution of government policy, whether it's in the justice system, etc. I like the idea, of the government of the Attorney General being able to say at some point in time, we're going to stop this prosecution or we're going to go ahead with it. And there are many instances when it's written into law, hate crimes, for instance. Hate crime charge can't be brought unless the Attorney General of the province where it's being brought actually personally signs off on it. That's actually written in law. So I like the idea of our elected representatives having the ability to, within reason, to be able to have some say and exercise some discretion in the application of law. Now, I know a lot of people, especially conservatives out there, are going to be up in arms about me, taking that position, but I don't think it's as black and white as people have made it out to be.
Well, plus, as soon as you said within reason, you threw black and white out the window.
Okay, well, fair enough. But having said that, okay, the point I'm making is that whatever happened in this SNC Lavalin fiasco, it does not, in my judgment, rise to the level of justifying bumping stuff off of the front pages or stuff off the top of our concern list. Top of the list should be what's happening with our citizens in China.
And I guess that's what I'm saying as well, that you have other things on the menu that are vital to the function, the main purpose of the government, and that is to protect and defend its citizens. When you have a foreign power who has put under threat one of your citizens, for whatever reason, whether it be legal or otherwise, you have an obligation as a government to do everything you can to mitigate that if it means bringing them out. If they'll do it, let me put it to you this way. If they'll do it for Omar Khadr, because they didn't like the way the Americans are treating him, why is this guy languishing in China?
Well, what are we going to do? We're going to send,
What do we do with Omar? We negotiated with the Americans and got him sent home.
Well, as I've said all along, I think that there has to be some give and take and some negotiation going on. It's unfathomable to me that the government of Canada at some level is not engaged with the government of China on behalf of these
maybe you're right,
citizens.
but my point is, where's the press putting the microphone in the face of the minister responsible saying, what's the latest?
Separate issue, and I concur with you completely on that. And this is the point I'm making, is that whatever went on with SNC-Lavalin and the Attorney General and the Public Prosecution Office, whatever went on in anything there or didn't go on, none of it, in my judgment, rises to the level of worry and concern that ought to be paid to any issue, and particularly this China issue. Well, and I'm very troubled, Nick, that nobody seems to care about it anymore in the media. And I can't believe that the government is not doing anything about these things, but I do agree with you. Why isn't the media paying attention to it? And if the media was paying more attention to it, wouldn't that have the effect of putting more pressure on the Chinese government? It's a fair question.
I would think so, but here again, I'm going to come back and lay this at the feet of the Prime Minister. Because he has lives at stake, he should want to get this. If there's nothing wrong, then why delay it? Let it get cleared up so they can get back to doing, as one Liberal put it today, the important work of government. Now, he meant something different than I mean by that, but I would say that going after China about this poor guy he may be a convicted drug dealer. Maybe he's guilty. Let's say, for the sake of this discussion, that he's as guilty as the Chinese claim that he is. We don't execute people in Canada for drug dealing. Maybe we should, but we don't. Okay, so he had to go after China and say, send him home so he can serve out the rest of his 10-year sentence in a Canadian prison. That's the role of the federal government. And the Prime Minister, in the exercising of his office, is playing politics with this guy's life by dragging out an affair that may damage him but end up getting this other guy killed.
Yeah, but we don't know that. Just because the Prime Minister is not talking about it publicly. But look, it's not just the Prime Minister, it's the media as well is not paying attention to it. And on top of that, where are the opposition parties, okay?
That's a good question, too. That's a very valid question.
The NDP is not raising this issue.
Neither
the
are the Tories.
NDP wants a public inquiry into SNC-Lavalin, okay? Where are the Conservatives? Where's Andrew Scheer? The opposition parties themselves have dropped this. And this is something that it bothers me so much that I've seen again and again and again, where opposition parties, be they the Conservatives or the NDP or whomever, rather than asking questions and probing in order to make sure that government is operating effectively and efficiently, and in this case, that Canadian citizens abroad are getting the kind of attention or protection that they deserve, right, that they need from our government. Instead of that, they're chasing what the media is paying attention to. And that bothers. This is, I'm not throwing stones at Andrew Scheer, the Conservatives, or at the NDP about this, because it's not just them, it's their predecessors as well. But we've gotten into this whole thing where the media dictates what politicians pay attention to. And so it's all about getting your soundbite now. And there are important questions that have to be answered that never get asked because it wasn't in the above the fold in the Globe and Mail or in the Toronto Sun or in the National Post today.
There's another element to this that I think the media is guilty of, and it's called intellectual journalistic laziness. It's the low-hanging fruit. It's easy. It's not easy to keep track of a story 6 or 7 or 8,000 miles away. When you don't have access to the Chinese prison, you can't get in and interview the guy. Even if you could, the expense for the news agency is huge to send somebody over there, get him the clearances. It's hard work to do that.
Okay, well here
and expensive.
Let me throw something else into this discussion. Okay, We just had this protest on Parliament Hill with truckers from Alberta.
Right.
We're going to talk more about that in the second hour. We have a guest coming on that could give us a little bit more insight about what's going on right now as we speak in Alberta with the energy sector and carbon pricing and taxes, etc. But here is an organized protest on Parliament Hill. Very reasonable. I don't think they were outlandish at all. I understand what their concerns are, and I support the idea that they protested. Why are not Canadian citizens marching in front of the Chinese embassy? Okay, and I'm not talking 1,000. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't even a dozen Canadian citizens marching in front of the Chinese embassy demanding that the Chinese government release Canadian citizens.
There's only one or two protesters that I've ever seen in front of the Chinese embassy here in Ottawa, and that were Falun Gong protesters about religious discrimination in China for their particular set of beliefs. That's it. I've never seen anybody else protest, and it's one of the world's great dictatorships. Great, I say that, like with air quotes. I'm not trying to elevate it. I'm not Trudeau, but sorry.
You're in this case Pierre Trudeau.
His son too.
Yeah, but Pierre was a big fan of communist.
Yeah,
China.
well, it seems to run in the family.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, the point is that you make a very valid point, but part of the reason they don't is because once the media locks onto something, and I'll go back to Rob Ford as an example, when they sink their teeth into something, they won't quit until there's a body. And I don't mean that in a literal sense, although I do think they played a role in his early demise. The pressure they put that and the stress they put on him, and I don't have any evidence to support this. This is just me speculating, but I think that drove him to an early grave. With all the demons that he had, certainly it didn't help. Let's put it that way. So they grab onto a story and they will not let it go. They will not ask the pertinent questions, let people come to their own conclusions, and then move on. In the case of this guy over in China, nobody knows his name. Nobody's promoting his cause. There's no interest in it because half of a good chunk of the reporters and the news anchors and newsrooms are socialistic in their outlook in life anyway. Now, I'm not going to say that they support outright communism, but it's not. It doesn't have any legs for them. It doesn't have any sex appeal.
I think that's it more than I don't think that there's any real sympathy for communist China here in this case. So I'm going to defend the media in that respect anyway. I think it's what you said. The second thing that you said.
There's no sex appeal. No legs to it.
There's no sex appeal. It's just people are not paying attention to it, and regrettably, if the media is not paying attention to it, then the general population is not going to pay attention to it. But you know what we should do is let's tell people now. We're going to find out what's going on, Nick, on this particular file. It's, by the time we do this show on Wednesday nights, it's already really kind of late. We can't make any phone calls or anything like that. But tomorrow, you and I are going to find out about this, and we're going to post some information on Facebook and Twitter and that, and keep people a little bit up to date. I'm interested, especially with the resignation of Gerald Butts. I am keenly interested as a Parliament watcher in what's going on behind the scenes, below the surface, that's precipitated that resignation. Clearly, there's more going on here than I also thought there was, but I don't know what it is. So I don't want to lose interest in that, but it seems to me that what's going on right now with Canadian citizens in China is far more important than that, and it needs to be paid attention to.
Well, as you're pointing out, here in Canada, nobody's lives at risk. In China, that's not the case. And whether he's guilty of drug dealing or not, we do not execute drug dealers. We incarcerate them for long periods of time, and in my mind, the right
or not.
Well, okay. Under the criminal code, we're supposed to. Let's put it that way. So, as a Canadian citizen, even a drug dealer has the right to defense from the threat of death by a foreign power, and the government needs to act on that. So let's find out what the story is, because I think he deserves to be brought home and let him finish his sentence here. He's not a terrorist. We're not talking Omar Khadr. He's not going to get $10.5 million, but I think he should serve out the rest of his sentence the 10-year sentence that the Chinese imposed on him to begin with in a Canadian prison. Because I'm not willing to let him go. If he is guilty of drug dealing, then he needs to be punished. He needs to spend time in jail. But I am not willing to see him sit on death row waiting for a political scandal here in Canada to determine his fate, whether the Canadian government can get back to. And maybe you're right. Maybe they're working behind the scenes. Maybe there is.
Well, I'm
negotiation.
sure there's stuff going on behind the scenes. That's quite normal.
Well, let's certainly hope that it works for this poor guy's case. But I do want to. If the media won't do this, and I'm with you, let's see what we can find. And we don't have the resources of a newsroom, but we can make phone calls, we can send emails, that kind of stuff, and see what we can find out about this guy, and let people know whether or not what the status is. Is he even still alive?
Well, and it's more than that. Let's find out, Nick. Let's find out what's going on. And here we are in Ottawa. We joke around about our secret bunker,
yep.
And we don't have to reveal the location, but to say, here we are in Ottawa. Let's find out what's going on, and is it worthwhile organizing a group of people to go and march in front of the Communist Chinese embassy and let them know, you know what, there are some Canadians here who have not forgotten about this particular issue. So maybe I'm going out on a limb, creating false expectations. I don't know, but it just seems to me a shame, bordering on a crime, that the media, I'm not going to blame the politicians, I'm not going to blame the government, because the government may not want to talk about this, okay? If all they're getting day in and day out right now is SNC-Lavalin, okay, from the media and from the opposition parties, that's what they're going to get. That's what they're going to talk about.
Right.
But the media has dropped the ball on this, and I say this with all due respect to my friends and colleagues in the opposition party, in the Conservative Party. I think you guys over there have dropped the ball on this as well. This should be one of the top questions. If you want to ask your first questions in question period about SNC-Lavalin, that's fine. But you know what? The leader of the Conservative Party, Andrew Scheer, gets 3 questions during question period, okay, for the Prime Minister or whomever he wants to question. You want to ask a question about SNC-Lavalin, you want to ask 2 questions, that's fine. But for pity's sake, please, let's get a question in about Canadians imprisoned in China as that particular crisis continues to evolve or devolve, or however you want to characterize it.
Maybe we can get Pierre Poilievre to take it, because you know what he's like when he gets hold of a question.
Whoever. And in fairness, the same with the NDP. The NDP should be asking questions about this as well. Okay, nothing I would expect can be as demoralizing for the families of these people who are wrongly imprisoned in China, Canadian citizens, for the families to feel that they're being ignored by the national media and by the politicians as they chase after what essentially is a media-generated story, in my judgment.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Okay, well, we're going to take a bit of a break here, and when we get back, we've got Russ Kuykendall. Hopefully he'll be calling in. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on in Alberta. So we'll be back in the Combat Zone in a couple of minutes.
Okay, you guys stay right there. We'll be back with more on the Combat Zone with Nick and Joe right after this. Okay, welcome back to the Combat Zone, folks. I'm Nick, he's Joseph, and we've had a pretty interesting first hour. We're going to carry on here and move over and talk about the protest downtown. Let's call it the pipeline protest. I believe that's what we decided on, because Joseph and I beforehand were debating what to actually call this thing. It's not a truckers protest, because that gives the wrong impression. It wasn't about truckers or trucking specifically, although truckers and trucking are certainly involved. It was about, basically, as I understand this, 3 things. One was putting pipelines in the ground. 2, revitalizing the oil patch, and 3, immigration and securing our borders. Those are the 3 things that I took as the main propellants for this protest. That's what brought people all the way from Red Deer, Alberta, and Newfoundland.
And I'm laughing because I can't think of, talking about...
How do you make that connection with the third
mixing
one?
metaphors is what comes to mind.
Okay.
We have here on the other line our guest for the second hour, Russ Kuykendall. And are you there, Russ?
I am.
Okay. Just now, I just want to make sure that we can all hear you properly.
I can hear him.
You can.
Okay.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot. Glad to be here.
So, I see there's Nick texting away. He's like my kid, like the kids in the middle of this. Here we are texting away.
I'm doing show
right?
business.
He's in show business,
That's
right?
right.
So, Russ, give us a little bit of background to this particular protest and that arrived in Ottawa. I guess it was yesterday, the truck protest from Alberta. Your background, you have quite a background in Alberta. You're from there, of course, and you also spent some time as the senior policy advisor to the Minister of Natural Resources, I think was Lisa Raitt. Am I correct about that?
Yes, yeah.
Right.
Director of Policy, same thing, to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Right. And
from 2006, 2010.
And of course, you have a fairly extensive knowledge of the energy sector generally and what's happening in Alberta in particular. And we have a couple of calls lined up here too, but I'll let you have at it for a few minutes. So why don't you give us a little bit of background?
Well, it's the pipeline protest is just that. It's a protest directed to the Prime Minister as to why pipelines have not been allowed to proceed, be it the Enbridge Northern Gateway from Alberta to Prince Rupert, or the Kinder Morgan expansion. There's an existing Kinder Morgan pipeline that runs from Alberta southwest toward the coast to the Delta at Vancouver, and that's now owned by the government of Canada, but it doesn't seem to be moving. And Energy East, which was canceled because of all the opposition, especially centered in Quebec, and right now there's the oil is still moving, but the oil is moving by train and by truck. And in Alberta, pipeline capacity is such that it's maxed out. And by pipeline capacity, I don't mean just the pipelines themselves. I mean the storage capacity. There's enormous storage capacity in Alberta for crude oil and crude oil products. And that has been maxed out to the point where there's no place to put it. The pipeline capacity is at max, and the storage capacity is at max. And there's 170 billion barrels of oil that's recoverable now, and up to 350 billion barrels of oil that is becoming recoverable in total. So 170 plus on up to 350 billion barrels of oil. Alberta has the third or fourth largest oil reserve in the world right now. And it's being kept in the ground because there's simply not the capacity to move it to market.
No, I just want to emphasize
any market.
Now, I just want to clarify that. So, because I don't think Canadians appreciate how much oil we have in Canada right now. So you're saying that Alberta has the third largest oil storage in the world?
No, what I'm saying is, if you take Alberta's proven reserves at about approximately 170 billion barrels, okay, it's the third or fourth largest oil reserve in the world.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I got the terminology wrong. Yeah,
if you move it on up to the potential reserves, 170 billion barrels means recoverable now with present technology and all the rest. Potential reserves are somewhere in excess of 315 million barrels of oil. Excuse me, 170 billion barrels of proven reserves. And yes, exactly. And, and it could move up to 315 billion barrels of reserve, of potential reserves.
That's a tremendous amount of oil. And
they've been extracting oil from the oil sand. This is mostly in the oil sands. They've been extracting oil from the oil sands since 1967, and it's somewhere around 2 billion barrels of oil. I think slightly less than 2 billion barrels of oil have been extracted to date.
So it's a drop in the bucket compared to.
So that's how much oil there is.
Yeah, it's just it boggles the mind. As far as the protest itself, I don't know if you heard my summary of what I thought the protest was about, or at least the people that I had talked to told me it was about. I had said that it was about moving energy around the country and to market, about the energy sector itself, and about immigration. Is that what this protest was really all about?
Well, I can't speak, too specifically from knowledge of the protest itself. I did not go up on the hill. It's a little cold in Ottawa right now, and I like my office. But I can tell you that the protest, I believe, is centered around the oil and gas industry in Alberta. And some of the other things have others were piggybacking issues on the oil and gas as an issue. And more power to them, I guess. It's a free country, or relatively free country, and where we have relatively free speech, and they're free to do that. But really, what this is driven by is the squelching, I wouldn't say shutdown, but limiting of development and of the oil industry in Alberta. And it's not just development, but extracting and moving the oil that's already been developed.
Okay, well, let me ask you, maybe you know a little more about some of the political reasons for this protest. Like, there's two bills out there that have a huge impact on oil exploration and extraction. I think one's Bill C-69, and I forget the number for the other one. What's in those bills that makes them so onerous? Do you know?
Well, it would effectively, if I read it correctly, C-69 is going to make environmental assessments so onerous as to shut down the possibility of any more development of pipelines or possibly even expansion of capacity for extraction of oil and gas. And I suppose you could add to that list coal, thermal and metallurgical coal that's produced in Alberta. It started with the increase in the carbon tax in Alberta. Before Premier Notley formed a government in 2015, Alberta already had a carbon tax on hydrocarbons. It was already in place. It was structured differently, but there was already a carbon tax in place. And so when Notley came in and formed a government, saying that she was going to implement a carbon tax, what that meant was she was going to increase the carbon tax significantly. And then later in 2015, Mr. Trudeau wins a mandate to govern federally, and he indicates that he's going to put on a carbon tax. Well, there were already carbon taxes across the country. And so Alberta's been hit doubly hard. They've got an NDP government that has increased the carbon tax over and above what it was when they took power. And then on top of that, Mr. Trudeau has piled on some more carbon tax. Before Notley took power, you could purchase a ton of thermal coal to heat your house for $55. And since the first stage, when the first stage of Ms. Notley's carbon tax was implemented, that increased that ton of coal to heat your home from $55 to, I believe, $87 a ton. Mm-hmm. And then it just, and it's I'd have to check the exact figures, but I'm fairly comfortable in saying that it's over $100 a ton, for a ton of coal. So that's the kind of percentage we're talking about in terms of the impact of the carbon tax on hydrocarbons.
Now, how long can you heat your house for with a ton of coal?
Well, it depends on the house. It wouldn't take more than coal is the cheapest way to heat a house, and it would take about 2 tons of coal max. And probably many homes, depending on the weather, you could hold it down to a ton. Well, that's the least expensive way to heat a home. But people are in Alberta, when natural gas went through the roof around 2007, a lot of greenhouses, a lot of dairy operations, hog barns, even beef cattle operations, they switched from where they had heating for their stock, and chicken farms and the whole bit. They switched from natural gas because the natural gas just went through the roof around 2008, and they switched to thermal coal. And so it'll take substantially more than a ton of thermal coal to heat a hog barn or a chicken farm or whatever.
I agree with that assessment.
Yeah, so those are the kinds of increases to their expenses that goes right to their bottom lines.
So this is partly what's got the West, let's say the Midwest, upset. Is this?
It is the West. I've never heard Alberta called the Midwest.
Well, compared to the socialist BC, it's they have a different view of politics in BC.
Well, let's say Alberta's the West and BC's just the left coast.
Okay, I can live with that. However you want to say it, Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba are a little annoyed. And you know something? With modern technology, there's no reason why we couldn't burn coal. The new technology behind it makes it a very viable fuel to heat homes. And considering the climate we live in, you would think that any reasonable government, and I put that in air quotes, would be all over that, because the whole point is to try to make life more affordable for people to live in Canada, not more expensive, but they seem to be going the other way.
Yeah, well, and that's just on the consumption side. That says nothing of the impact of those carbon taxes on development and development of greater capacity of extraction, and the impact on getting pipelines built. There's a lot of talk about getting pipelines to Tidewater, and what that means is that oil and gas producers would like to have access to more than one market. Effectively, right now, the very large majority of the oil and gas, anyway, that Alberta produces goes to one market, one geographical market, and that's the United States.
That's right.
Yeah. And so when we talk about getting a pipeline to Tidewater or increased pipeline capacity to Tidewater, it's about opening new markets for oil and gas producers to sell their product, not just to refineries and consumers in the United States, but also to purchasers from be it China or Japan or India or Europe, certainly. Right now, a lot of the feedstock that's coming from Alberta to refineries in Louisiana and Texas is going directly to those refineries and then being sold as ultra-low sulfur diesel in Europe, in Western Europe, in the EU.
So okay. So when it comes to in your experience, because I understand the frustration behind this kind of a protest. I mean, it costs a lot of money to run a tractor without paying a trailer full of paying cargo in the back. And I know that from firsthand experience. Any amount of miles, never mind, the 2,500 or so they drove from Red Deer to Ottawa. Oh, come on. I was thinking these guys are out there, and I guess what I'm asking, let me rephrase this. In your experience, have you ever seen protests like this bear any real fruit?
Well, what do you mean by fruit? I think the best way, I think it does put some sort of pressure on things. It does. I think it's important for people to express themselves. It is a relatively free country. Is it going to change anything? Well, I don't know. I guess I'll just be agnostic on that point. The stakes are very large. Shortly after she won a mandate in 2015, Premier Notley spoke to a crowd on Wall Street in New York City in Manhattan. And after she did that, there were a number of heads of large institutional investment funds present. And there was at least one that I heard about through the grapevine who was present, who canceled in excess of $100 billion of investment in Alberta.
Wow.
But because of what you heard the new premier say. When we're talking about I led with the cost to consumers, but the more important issue is the cost to investment in the Alberta oil and gas sector. It's not just billions, as with say an Oshawa car plant, that may lose somewhere on the order of $5 billion of production. It's hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that has been stopped stopped from going into Alberta, has been withdrawn from Alberta for the most part. There have been one or two projects that have started up again, but for the most part, hundreds of billions of dollars are being kept are being held back from being put into Alberta and investing in new projects.
Now, when does it? Go ahead. Finish your sentence. I'm the beginning of my sentence is trampling all over the middle of yours.
Well, and those hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, is sure that the greatest impact and benefit is in Alberta, whether you're talking to the Alberta economy, the creation of jobs, or revenues to the public treasury of Alberta. But the second and third largest impacts are in Ontario and Quebec, because Quebec, produces machinery and equipment, and Ontario produces all kinds of things that are used produces steel up until at least quite recently, and a number of other things that are used in the expansion of that capacity in Alberta. It also affects places like Saskatchewan that roll pipe that goes into Alberta, and then the impacts to places like Cape Breton Island and Newfoundland that supply a lot of skilled tradesmen who don't have industrial trade jobs to go to expand that capacity in Alberta. So it's not just Alberta that's affected. It's the entire economy of Canada. A few years ago, I wrote a discussion piece, about 60 or 70 pages, called Canada's New Industrial Revolution. And what I identified then as Canada's New Industrial Revolution back in 2014 was the expansion of extraction capacity in the oil and gas sector in Alberta. But not just in Alberta, but extraction of natural resources across the country. in places like Northern Ontario,
I guess,
as well as Alberta.
I guess what I was trying to get at was because I'm taking everything and I understand what the points that you're making, but my point was, and I guess the other side of this coin, I'm almost answering my own question, is what else do you want them to do? But protests of this nature, let's take a good example is the pro-life protest in Ottawa every year. 20,000 plus show up and have for years on Parliament Hill and haven't been able to achieve any real measurable results. So when these people left Red Deer and the East Coast, I'm including both sides of the country because that's the truth, do they really expect to do anything but vent their protest, their frustration at the government? Because obviously the government isn't interested in listening to them, or they would have had the Prime Minister come out meet with them, and he didn't do that.
Well, I will say, I think I see where you're going or what you're questioning is the effectiveness of the protest.
Yeah, that's right.
And again, I guess I will be agnostic on that, except to say that one of the healthy things that we can do in a relatively open democracy like Canada is we can vent our frustration and even anger. And I think that's not something we fear. That's a healthy thing. I think what's unhealthy is for that anger and frustration to be pent up. I think we've seen what happens, south of the 49th and other southern borders when I think the best analysis of what's happened with Mr. Trump and effectively the takeover of the Republican Party by a very different outlook of people. In that, I think the best analysis of that comes from J.D. Vance, who wrote a little book called Hillbilly Elegy. And in Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance described the kind of people that he grew up among in eastern Ohio, in the Rust Belt. And his family came from the hillbilly country of southern Kentucky. And he talked about the culture and the frustration and the loss of jobs, the loss of the type of jobs that will allow people to marry and have children and support a family and pay a mortgage and all the rest of it. A few years ago, I remember a meeting for which I was present where we were talking about the forestry industry in Canada, how it's been affected. Forestry affects, 4 or 5 provinces. It affects BC and Quebec, but it also affects New Brunswick and Ontario and Saskatchewan and Alberta.
Yes, it does.
And perhaps most of all, it affects, I suppose, has the greatest impact on the provincial economies of Quebec and BC. And so we're talking about, how do we solve this problem? How the forest industries have just been, have been really hit hard, very hard, to the point where, a lot of people don't have jobs. And so one of the fellows at this meeting, a fairly high level meeting in the last government, expressed, maybe we get more tourism jobs in Quebec. And so I asked a question along the lines of, ask the experts in the room, what would be the average value of a tourism job? Well, at that time, it was somewhere around $30,000 a year. And I said, up until things started to collapse, what was the average value of a forestry job in Quebec? Well, somewhere around, $60,000 to $70,000 a year. Yeah, and I really didn't have to say too much more.
No.
That's the natural resources industries across the country, not just in Alberta, but natural resources industry across the country are potentially the source of the ability of men and women to marry, to make families, to pay mortgages, and raise their kids and send them off to school somewhere or to a place where they can acquire a skilled trade. It's not just about services, financial services or teaching in a school or working in a hospital. As important as those things are, we need all these sectors. We need the skilled trades. We need project managers. We need the knowledge industry that attaches to the various extraction industries, be it coal and oil and gas, or the metals in Northern Ontario, or wherever, or the forestry industry. A lot of those industries are knowledge intensive. They're not just hewers. We're not just hewers, and we're not just talking about hewers of wood and drawers of water, as the epithet goes. It's really about a whole range of things that are attached to those industries that produce real stuff that can be sold to real customers.
Russ, I have to stop you there. We're out of time for this segment, but thank you very much for your insights. We hope to have you back on the show again soon, because you obviously have a lot to offer in this area. So thank you very much for your time this evening. We appreciate it. And for those of you listening online, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be back with more here on the Combat Zone with Nick and Joe right after this.
Okay, you are back in the Combat Zone. I am Joe, he is Nick, and we're heading into the home stretch, the final 30 minutes of tonight's show. It's
been busy on the show tonight. I mean, it's always busy, but we've had a lot of activity in the chat room over at the Listen Live side of the Combat Zone website. So there's a whole bunch of people in there talking everything from politics to airplanes. And we also have had... We've got a call on the line, which for us is a great thing because we love taking phone calls. Who have you got queued up for us, Joseph?
Vlad.
Oh, yes, Vlad.
Hello,
Vlad. Can you hear us?
Hey, guys. How you doing tonight? Oh. Yeah, I can. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine. I feel like a turtle up on a fence post.
Hey. Should we be referring to you as Vlad?
I think so.
Okay. But before we get into the protest on Parliament Hill, because I know you were there, and you can give us a little bit of insight to exactly what was going on, etc. But take a minute, if you don't mind, and tell us about your blog.
Well, I'd be honored. Thank you. My blog is basically I think I really encourage people to go and read, they click on the page that says the agendas and views of this site. And so I don't mind people disliking me, or I don't mind people disliking my site, but I would prefer that they do it for the right reasons. So if you go to vladtepesblog.com and you click on the link that says agendas and views of the site, you'll see that I started it because I noticed there was a distinct difference between what was out the window and what was on TV, and that was very disturbing to me. The more I looked into things, the more I realized there was something going on that wasn't situation normal. So I started a thing to talk about Islam and its effect on the West, because it seemed to be a taboo subject, which I don't understand, because the whole point of Western civilization is to freely discuss ideas and their value and determine what ideas should be employed in our culture and civilization in the greater sort of matrix of freedom. And you weren't allowed to talk about Islam. You weren't allowed to talk about immigration issues. And of course, then there was also the issue of leftism, which I think all boils down to.
Well, listen, one of the things, first of all, I've frequented your website, and it's very educational, and not just from a Islamic point of view, educating us about the threat of Islamic terrorism and things like that, but from what's going on in the world stage that people aren't being told about, the mainstream media. As I don't know if you were listening earlier to Joseph and I, But we were talking about this poor guy in China, and I call him poor guy. He may be, as far as I know, a real convicted drug dealer. Maybe the Chinese got it right. But he had a 10-year sentence, and now he's under the threat of death. So from that perspective, the media's dropped the ball on this guy because it's not sexy. At least that's my perspective. And I notice a lot of that on your particular website, which is vladtepesblog.com, right?
Right. Thank you. Yes.
I just want to put that.
Well, if you want me to weigh in on that particular case, there's two distinct sides of it. One is that the Chinese government, since the arrest of one of their chief spies, which is one of the board members of the Huawei telecom company, which is in fact the same company that is under indictment for assisting Iran with its nuclear weapons program and a number of other top-level geopolitical sort of international crimes. The Chinese government's grabbed, 13 Canadians and arrested them? A lot of them are completely bogus, right?
Yeah.
But that particular guy was given a warning by a Vancouver judge in a previous conviction where he should have done hard time. And the judge said, look, I'm against my better judgment because somebody had made a really good appeal on his behalf. I'm going to give you like a no custody sentence on this. But he said, my prediction is things are going to go very badly for you if you don't change how you're living your life and what you're doing very soon. This guy was a multiple repeat large-scale drug dealer. He had had ample warnings and a better chance than most. And while I think what happened to him in China was a consequence of this geopolitical situation with Huawei, he in particular isn't not deserving.
Okay.
Right? It's a little, you have to do a bit of math on that sentence, but you know what I mean.
I get what you're driving at. Now, when Joseph and I were talking about this earlier, my attitude is, look, we do not execute people for drug dealing in this country. Maybe we should, but we don't. Okay, sometimes in this case, as an example, we don't even incarcerate them. But he still is a Canadian citizen, and if we will go to the lengths we went through for Omar Khadr, a known confessed terrorist, doesn't this guy deserve some kind, the ability, the right at least to come home and finish his sentence in Canada rather than be sitting on death row in China?
Well, yes. I mean, if you're asking me what justice would look like, I think, first of all, the first case with Khadr isn't justice, so it doesn't fit the equation at all. What happened, Khadr should still be in Guantanamo Bay, in my opinion.
Yes.
But in any case, what happened with him has nothing to do with justice. There's something very evil. In fact, I also think the amount paid to him was $20 million, and 9.5 went to his lawyer, which is why they published the figure of 10.5 going to him. And it was the fact that it was 10.5 million that made me suspicious. That sounded kind of like the amount you get after your lawyer takes his cut. So I think the real amount was probably 20 million. And if you look at the way it was phrased back in the day, you'll see they were cagey about saying the amount. They didn't quite say that was a total payout. They just said that's what Khadr got. In any case, it's not justice. This other guy committed a crime in China knowing what the consequences were. And I feel like there's a certain responsibility on the individual when they go to another country to recognize that there may be different sets of standards and rules. In the same way we would expect people to come to Canada and adopt our laws and our rules. Now, this is awkward because I don't want to defend China on this. I generally speaking agree that it would be better if he had to finish his sentence in Canada. But the fact that he was let off by a Vancouver judge and specifically warned that something really bad might happen to him if he kept this up, and the fact that he went to a country which is famous for executing people and did something that was bad for all parties concerned, like dealing hard drugs. I think it was fentanyl or carfentanil or something. Then, you know what I mean? It's kind of like hard to have a lot of sympathy for that particular guy.
Okay. Well,
that's my opinion anyway.
Let's switch gears and we'll talk about the protest downtown. When I talked to you on the phone yesterday or the day before about seeing the Mohawk flag downtown. First of all, Mohawks, by and large, come from the United States in the upper New York State area. They do have an island in the St. Lawrence or in the Seaway. I forget whether it's in the St. Lawrence or it's in in around Kingston somewhere. No, New York State is probably in the Seaway. Anyway, the point is they do have an island in Canada that they claim is their territory, but they're not from Alberta. So what were they doing there? So with that as a question in the back of my mind, we talked about what other groups might be hitchhiking and trying to dilute the message that was coming out of Alberta, the frustration with energy policy, with carbon taxes, even with immigration, those kinds of things. What did you see? Did you see any kind of group that you would call a hate group, or who was there?
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, there was a lot of problems. There was a lot of people interfering with what was initially planned and what was initially supposed to happen. And some of these people who are interfering are allegedly friends of ours. And so I'm going to see if I can figure out how to put this. I think that the initial plan was it was a yellow vest protest that had planned to bring a convoy up here, and their issues were, and not in any particular priority. It was the UN. It was anti-UN, anti the UN Global Migration Pact, especially, that they felt that shouldn't have been signed. It should have at least been put to a referendum. But they were against the UN Migration Pact. They want the borders tightened up. They want Bill M103 overturned and a return to freedom of speech, and a return to the Canada we all knew 15 or 20 years ago, but in particular before Trudeau. And it was anti-Trudeau. And it didn't have any particular party affiliation. And of course, it was also connected to the issues of Alberta energy. Now, it looks like, and I'm saying this isn't what happened, but it may have been what happened. It appears to be that somehow certain people injected themselves into the process and convinced the truckers that they should distance themselves from the yellow vesters because the yellow vesters were dirty, rotten racists, which of course is ludicrously untrue. The yellow vesters are the most grassroots of Canadians you're going to meet. And I've met a lot of them, and I've communicated with several of them across Canada, and generally speaking, they're just us. They're just like the three of us. They have the same values, same views, and they've decided to put on yellow vests and join the global protest against the increasing amount of socialism and communism that is inflicting itself on Western nations. So what happened is different groups got in there and convinced them to distance themselves from the yellow vests and make it just about a pipeline, which was an issue that coincidentally the Conservative Party could suddenly come out with a policy statement. So some of the people that got involved with this were trying to avoid having Maxime Bernier speak. And interestingly, yesterday, there's 4 or 5 Conservative MPs, Andrew Scheer, plus several others got up and spoke, which I found very interesting. And it was all about the Alberta oil issue and the energy sector. Not saying that isn't important, but that wasn't the only issue. And again, when this truck convoy was traveling across Canada, every stop they went, every town they went to, Thunder Bay, all these different towns they went through, there were tons of people in yellow vests waving these guys by. Right? It was most distinctly a yellow vest event all across Canada. And the media did not cover it. The media went way out of their way to not discuss it, and also to try to make the yellow vesters look like they were evil, dirty, rotten racists because they believe we ought to have a border, we shouldn't have Sharia law, and that Islam shouldn't have special protection from criticism in law, as M103 says it does. So, in fact, I saw a bunch of CBC people. You could call it interviewing, but it was actually getting people to sit there and stammer and sputter that they weren't racists. It was really quite Soviet, to be honest with you. The CBC they are not a news organization. Whatever they may be, they are not news. They are a narrative-driven organization, and they make it their job to make sure that that's what people see and that's what people think. And you know what? I don't think they were particularly appreciated. They weren't really wearing much in the way of ID either. Global was there, and you could see that they were global. They had markings. And the CBC kind of had a little card in their pocket. Anyway, so there were lots of groups. Antifa was there yesterday, but not today. And they were kettled very nicely by the police, so they didn't really cause a lot of trouble. A reporter from the Rebel went to go talk to them, which is always a mistake. Antifa doesn't talk, they attack, and they smashed his phone. And they hit the guy. So there's going to be some fallout from that.
No, that wasn't in the media.
And in terms of... Well, that's because the media won't cover anything to do with the Rebel, because the Rebel isn't a narrative network. As it turns out, there is a fellow who filmed the guy. If you go to the rebel.media, you can see the footage of him trying to talk to them and them hitting him and smashing his phone. You can see the phone hitting the ground, the whole works. And it broke his phone as well. So that's what, anyway, that's one of Antifa's classic tricks. The police did nothing until I think the Rebel guy plus another guy who was there just pushed the police to file an assault charge. And I think something is happening. But the police initially did nothing. They were just completely indifferent to an assault that took place right in front of their eyes. So I guess that's because Antifa gets passed, because it's kind of like having, a caged wild animal. You know what they're going to do if you stick your finger in the bar. And maybe there's something to be said for that, but I prefer a nation that's ruled by law. There are also groups that came up. I'm going to walk a really tight line here and say there is other groups that came up to participate in this who I question their values as being quite as classically liberal as the Yellow Vests. The Yellow Vesters, from what I can tell and who I talk to, I mean, obviously no two people think exactly the same. No group is a hive mind, but generally they seem to really care about the right issues. A return to classical liberalism, a return to, Canadian values and our rule of law, and a proper nation state with borders and a government that looks after the interests of those people inside that border from whom they draw taxes. And but there were a couple of other groups that came up, which I have my suspicions of. I think they may be they may be a bit more about ethnicity than the rest of us, and I think that it may be fair to talk about them. But I think if you do, you should have evidence, and I think that you shouldn't mix them in with. I really don't think it's right or just to tar the entire group with one group that may decide to inject itself into that situation. And I think that's what the media does. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't put somebody in there, Antifa, for instance, to put somebody with a yellow vest on and make some symbols. And that happened. There's pictures that came out of a guy making Hitler salutes in a yellow vest or something. But, no one, if a real Nazi just wouldn't do that. They're just not that stupid, Like, they're not going to put a yellow vest on and try to destroy. It just isn't in their interest. So
no, of course not. So, okay, so obviously there was, now do you think this all was to try to, by adding on all these peripheral groups to the main protest, whether you think it was about carbon tax or pipelines or whatever it was, that there was an attempt behind the scenes to water down by including groups that weren't necessarily interested in the main objective? Do you think there was some... I'm asking you to speculate here because there's no way to prove this stuff. But did you see any evidence that would suggest that there were groups there whose whole mission was to water down the main message?
Well, I think there was, in fact, a plan that started well before this convoy got to Ottawa to divide this group into two groups that were mutually suspicious of each other. It did not work in its entirety, but it did work a little bit. It was supposed to be a Yellow Vest event, and then it became an Alberta convoy about oil. And the Alberta convoy was convinced to some degree to distance themselves from the Yellow Vests, but they weren't successful because every town they went through, the support they had was from Yellow Vesters, and it was huge. And in fact, I spoke to one of the main organizers earlier, a fellow named Mark Friesen, and he's got a very big Facebook following. And in fact, what happened to his Facebook's, it was interesting. His live stream hit something like 15,000 people, and then for the first time ever, it just went fuzzy, and then went crappy, and then went dead, and then nobody else could see anything on his page. He got locked out by Facebook, and I find that very unusual. It's never happened to him before, this guy. So there seems to be a pretty big concerted effort by media to either not report on this or distort the message, or by social media platforms to prevent this getting out. But the Yellow Vesters were there in spades despite this effort. And I got to tell you, I think that the people that were responsible for doing this were affiliated with some of the guest speakers. I think there's enough information there for y'all to figure out who I mean.
Yeah, I think so. Let me ask you this question. Just as we're running out of time here, old man time doesn't stand still for even me, or Joseph for that matter. If you could summarize the event, did it achieve anything? Did it achieve any of its goals, like other than just venting frustration, which in and of itself is a worthy goal? Because what else are you going to do? Because when people get too frustrated, then things get ugly. As Winston Churchill's famous for saying, "I'd rather jaw than talk." Or how did he put it? I'd rather talk than fight.
I'd rather jaw than fight, or something. They're war. Jaw's better than war.
That's it. Because when the talking stops, the fighting starts. We don't want that. So if you could take the last 2 or 3 minutes here of the show and just kind of summarize the event for us.
Well, I would have to say that, in some ways and for some people, it was very successful. I think that it became, at the end of the day, at least yesterday, it became basically a propaganda event for the Conservative Party of Canada and for Andrew Scheer. And today, not so much. Today, the Yellow Vesters who actually held the permits for Parliament Hill made some distinct changes and put the thing back on track, and it became their event. But then today, very few people showed up. Antifa didn't show up today, for instance. It's hard to get people during the week to go to a protest 2 days in a row.
Yeah.
I think that that it was successful and that thousands of people on Facebook saw it. I think it wasn't that successful in Ottawa because everything is so controlled. The media is so controlled that no one even knew this was going on. Even people that are fairly hip politically didn't know this was even happening, right? And there were not a lot of people on the Hill. I'd say there was a few hundred, and it wasn't well handled for various reasons. So, I don't think it was as successful as it should have been. But then you have to ask yourself, how many people know about the pro-life demo that happens every year, where there's tens of thousands of people, and do you ever see about it? Do you ever see it on TV? Do you ever hear about it? Do you ever read about it in the paper? Right?
It's not
extraordinary how
it's normally after the fact.
Certainly not what's going on. Yeah, or before. It's just personally, I think it's down to what the Soviets used to call, not the Soviets, but the poor, unfortunate citizens of the Soviet Union used to call samizdat, which was the habit of passing information which the government didn't like from hand to hand, or in handwritten notes or scribbles left in books. I think that we're not going to be able to rely on centralized information sources anymore. It's going to have to be shows like this.
Unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer people who even understand the reference to the old Soviet Union.
Yes, and it is unfortunate. Because, Mark Twain once said, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yeah.
And I have to say, the people that I know that escaped from the Soviet Union are terrified of what they see happening in Canada. And that's across the board. People who left from Hungary, from the Czech Republic, from Russia, obviously. And they people who I know who escaped tell me that what they see here in some ways is worse because of the whole, you can't even discuss whether or not there is such a thing as a sex change operation. And the forced, like C-17, the forced pronoun bill, there was nothing that bad in the Soviet Union, But so they're quite frightened. I know people that have moved back to Hungary and who escaped, like whose family came here to escape communism from Hungary, and now they've moved back to Hungary to escape communism in Canada.
Yeah,
so I think people should start paying attention.
With Viktor Orban leading Hungary, I can see why they would want to go back. Listen, James.
He's doing incredible stuff.
I certainly hope you'll join us again, where there's lots of positive feedback in the chat room about your presence here this evening. So that's good news.
Well, it's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure to talk to you both. Anytime at all, please. I'd be happy to go into some of these European issues in more depth, because I think that there's a lesson for us in what's taking place in Europe. There's elections which have been rigged in favor of the left are still being run by people who want to gain back national sovereignty, like in Italy with Salvini and Orban, and it's very interesting, and we have to be paying attention to that.
All right. Thank you very much, James. We appreciate it. You have a great night, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Good night. Thanks.
Good night. Okay, we've got just a couple minutes, or a minute or two, and there's a topic we didn't get to tonight. And I want to at least mention it in passing. We don't have time to dig into it, but for those of you who don't know, who are living in Ontario, you probably know the name Randy Hillier if you're a political junkie at all. Randy Hillier got his start as the head of the Ontario Landowners Association. He's a trained electrician by trade. He was came up in it, cut his teeth in the trades, was responsible for getting the OLA started, and then got elected to the provincial, to Queen's Park. He's on his, third term now?
I don't know. A few. I wouldn't have said he was an old timer, but he's been there now for a few years. That's
I think
for sure.
It's his third term. Anyway, regardless, he got booted out of caucus today. Now, the story in the Globe and Mail, between you and me, Joseph, I'm not going to say I don't believe it, but I think it's been taken out of context. And if they will, I just am still sitting here trying to wrap my head around it. I wish we had time to get into it.
Well, you know what? Let's put it off till next week, and maybe what we'll do is we'll reach out to Randy and see if he'll come on next week with us.
That'd be very interesting. We keep this up, we might have to push this to a 3-hour show.
Oh, yeah, that I don't know about that. We'll see.
Yeah, well, that's said somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but certainly I'd love to have him on and get his side of the story, because I do not think that the Globe and Mail was told the whole story, or if they did, they certainly didn't put it in the right context.
Let's just put it this way, just for people who are listening, just to summarize, there was a protest in the legislature, people who were in the gallery protesting about some of the reforms that the Ford government have brought into the program helping parents with autistic children. And without getting into details about all of that, there are parents that were in the gallery protesting. And whether it was on the floor of the legislature or on the way out, Randy Hillier apparently said something along the lines of yada, yada, yada. Okay. In fact, those were the exact words he's alleged to have said. And I guess some people thought he was referring to the protesters who were saying something to him. He says no, he was directing that towards somebody from the New Democratic Party who had said something. But he also said, and I heard this in his statement, he also said he apologized profusely. If anyone took it out of context or anything, he certainly didn't mean any offense by it. And in my judgment, that should have been the end of it. I take him at his word that he wasn't trying to insult or be demeaning to any member of the public, and even if he had been impulsive, and sometimes things get very heated and frustrating, and he immediately thought better of it and said, well, I'm sorry, I should not have said that. So, pardon me. That should have been the end of it. I was surprised to learn that he was suspended from caucus because of this, but who knows? Let's reach out and we'll see if we can't get on to talk a little bit about that and what's actually happening at Queen's Park. So, but we're running a little bit over time now, Nick. So I think it's been a pretty good show, and we've had a lot of activity in the chat room and some good calls, some good guests. But look, too much of a good thing is not a good thing. So,
all right.
So that said,
we're going to exit stage left, as the Panther used to say. I forget his name now, but exit stage left. So you guys have a great night. We'll see you all again next week. And this is Nick and Joe signing off from the Combat Zone.
And Nick, just for you.